Hi, everyone. I'm Lena Armstrong, VP of Editorial for SC Magazine here, welcoming you to today's 2020 webcast, which will be taking a closer look at ways to build secure services in the cloud. Indeed, our 2020s as interview-based talks with an array of industry experts give us chances to examine the latest in information security topics a bit more thoroughly on a pretty regular basis nowadays, so that you can stay informed on some of the most current best practices and strategies to strengthen your overall IT security and risk management plans and practices. For this one in particular, which is being sponsored by Sumo Logic, we're looking to bring more clarity to what it takes to keep data safe and sound in the cloud, given the myriad differences between security of corporate networks versus cloud environments. Considering that CISOs and their teams have no real physical access to the cloud infrastructures on which many of their organizations now rely, a different way of thinking is required. Here with me now is Joan Pepin, VP of Security and CISO with Sumo Logic, who has more than 17 years of technical, operational, and management experience in security across numerous markets. And together, we're going to suss out just some of the short and long-term tactics needed to create a secure cloud-based infrastructure that accounts for the risks and threats that could impact its sanctity, as well as all the data and applications supported by those very cloud operations. So welcome, Joan. I'm really glad that you could be here with us today.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here.
Now, before Joan and I get going, I just want to note very quickly that we're definitely looking for questions from all of you, so do send them in as you have them. And if it makes sense, we'll take them during the course of our conversation. If not, we'll be sure to tackle as many as we can during a Q&A at the end. So with that, I'll kick things off with Joan. The first question is multi-tiered, Joan. It's a little bit loaded, packed, but it should set the tone pretty nicely for our talk. So aside from physical access to the servers, what's different in the cloud that has the greatest impact on data security? Are the frameworks and models all that different from a traditional data center? And probably most importantly, what are some of the current concerns that you're really hearing from your own customers?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question and a great way to start. I think that, the answer is both that it's not all that different, and yet at the same time it's extremely different. And I'll drill into that a little bit more. I am a great believer in actually the security advantages that we can garner by moving from a traditional data center into the cloud. And I believe that there's a great opportunity there because the framework is just different enough that it will allow us to do a lot of the things that we're not able to do right now that we know we should be doing. So, in my opinion, the state of the typical enterprise legacy data center is probably not a very good one when it comes to security. Lots of compromises have had to be made. Security people very rarely were the architects of these data centers. The typical way that it works out is the data center is architected and designed and everything is racked and stacked, and then security is asked to secure this thing that they did not build. And as we all know, reverse engineering, back-ending security into something that's already been built and designed is much more difficult than being able to be there designing it in from the beginning. So one opportunity that presents itself if we move from a traditional data center into the cloud is simply the opportunity to rethink our security models and redesign in a green field. But more importantly than that, the cloud brings all of this scale, APIs, an ability to automate, an ease of onboarding, an elasticity and ease of scale. These are all the reasons why so many of our users are going the shadow IT route and are moving to the cloud, because it's easy, because it's scalable, because it meets their needs. And a lot of CISOs are worried about this move to the cloud because they don't have that control. My approach has been different. I call it a little bit of judo, to use those same strengths that draw our users to the cloud to secure our cloud environment. I believe that there's a lot of stuff that we're not doing right now in our data centers that we wish we were. We wish we had more packet filtering. We wish we had more intrusion detection. We wish we had file integrity monitoring everywhere. We wish that we had all of our services registered and only allowed services that have a business need and that have been specifically allowed to run are being run. And it's very difficult in a traditional data center environment to exercise all of those controls. However, when we move into the cloud, particularly a public cloud provider, we have the ability to use a lot of the tools and APIs that they've developed to do the types of things that we're not doing in our data centers now. Now, I do think it's a mistake, a big mistake some companies make, a lot of companies make, to sort of copy their current infrastructure and paste it into the cloud. They just do like a Control-X, Control-V, and they take all their security problems with them. And at that point, since you've got a slight misalignment in models, you might actually be adding more security issues. But if you take the time to be thoughtful and think about what services you're running, what service that you're presenting to your customers, be those external customers, internal customers, whatever business you're in, you have the ability in the cloud to automate so much that you're relying on manual processes for now.
Very good. And certainly then it sounds these are some of the issues that you're hearing from your customers. You're seeing them sort of try to apply their old way of thinking to this new environment.
Yeah, I get asked a lot by our customers to talk to them about how we've been able to achieve so much security and compliance in the cloud. We're one of, if not the most compliant and audited and attested companies in our space. And repeatedly our customers say, how do you do that in the cloud? And I have presentations I give or I go on site and I talk to them a lot about what the best practices are. I think there's a lot of eagerness out there to take advantage of the cloud, but there's also a lot of trepidation and a lot of concern. And there's also a lot of emotional reactions to the cloud, right? Security people tend to be a little conservative for good reason. But sometimes that conservatism becomes more of an emotional resistance to change. So that's a big part of what I've been dealing with for the past 4.5 years is sort of overcoming emotional objections with rationality.
And you mentioned this whole notion of being compliant. Regardless of where corporate data resides, governmental and industry compliance regulations require very specific levels of security. How can a CISO meet these compliance requirements, especially when the data could reside across multiple geographic regions on their service provider's physical infrastructure? That's one that we often get asked at our own events.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a big concern. So, my first advice is to work with your cloud service provider. For instance, Sumo Logic makes extensive use of Amazon Web Services. And we have worked out for our customers in Europe and our customers in Australia that their data remains within those geographic regions, within those legal boundaries. So at Sumo Logic, we have basically 3 areas we operate from: the United States, the European Union, and Australia. And in each of those cases, we've arranged things with our service provider, with our infrastructure as a service provider, Amazon, to ensure that our customer data always will remain in those legal jurisdictions. And so it's absolutely something that you need to be mindful of, but the solutions exist. You just need to work with your provider and make sure that you're asking the right questions and designing your system the right way to take those considerations in mind if those are things that you're concerned with.
Very good. And that's actually an extremely valid point and leads to some more questions that we often get at our physical and, our online events. When a company develops a relationship with a cloud service provider, what should they be asking them about security? And maybe, I guess, you could shed some light on some of the areas that they're not asking about that they should, if you get what I'm saying.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I think that, one of the first questions that you need to ask is, has your service been audited or attested by a third party, by an independent third party? So many cloud providers out there that are just startups that are young, are still not mature, will rely on their infrastructure providers' certifications and audits. What you'll hear a lot is, well, we run in a data center that's ISO 27001, or we run in a data center that has PCI compliance. Well, that's great. That's a great foundation and foundational building block, but that's very different than having your own service audited and attested for security. And so some key certifications to look for that don't just belong to the data center are things like SOC 2, ISO 27001, TCI DSS, HIPAA. Have they been audited for HIPAA if you are a covered entity or a business associate and you need to worry about HIPAA? These are all questions that you should absolutely be asking, and I'll want to drill into that just a little bit more. In the example of companies, and people try to sell this to me all the time. I'm really shocked. People will say, I'll ask, are you audited? Do you have security attestations? And they'll say, well, our data center, they won't even put in the well, oh, our data center is, or they'll even say just yes. And then when you ask to see the report, it's their data center's report. It's Amazon's report, not theirs. And I like to make the analogy that, you can go to meet a financial planner, and they might have a fantastically prestigious address somewhere in downtown Manhattan on the 50th floor of some skyscraper. And you get to the skyscraper, and the landlord has paid for security guards. There's 3 or 4 of them sitting in the lobby. And they don't let you up to the 52nd floor unless they know you've got an appointment to meet that financial manager. And they check your ID, and they sign you in, and they walk you over to the elevator, and they press the button, and they use their little key card to make sure that you can only go to the 52nd floor. Well, that's very much like your infrastructure provider. That's very much what your cloud provider provides for you, is that level of physical security. Now, once you get to that 52nd floor, the landlord has no say over what that financial planner is going to do with your money. And so has that guy on the 52nd floor, has he been audited? Is he running an ethical business? Simply because he's running in a prestigious address does not mean that he's following all the rules that might be expected given the surroundings, right? So a very key question is, has your service been audited for security, and can you share those reports with me? And it's a question that some people are mature enough and savvy enough to ask, but not nearly enough people.
That's also quite an interesting one, because you're starting to get into another area where oftentimes these guys do, a single service provider and might involve multiple third-party technologies as part of their services, entire supply chain. So what are some of the precautions that a company should be taking before even engaging a cloud company to ensure that that supply chain meets or exceeds all of their requirements, whether they be security requirements or compliance requirements, whatever?
Yeah, excellent question. And so the first thing, and this is going to sound, so basic, which is why I've moved on to this slide here, but so many people don't take some of these fundamental steps. The first thing to know is, what exactly is your risk tolerance, and what are you trying to protect? What type of data is this? What's in that data? You would be really surprised how many customers come to us and they say, what are your, are you able to secure this kind of data? What are your security measures? And we ask them, well, what do you want to put in the system? And they don't know. They simply want you to be as secure as possible because they don't know what's in their own data stream. And so before you engage a service provider, you should know exactly what it is that you're dealing with. What are your crown jewels that you're trying to protect? How much is that worth? What are you doing to secure it today? So many times customers come to us and they ask very difficult questions about how we secure the data, and they're very concerned. And when you ask what they're doing with that data today, they're practically doing nothing to secure it. So what is your current risk tolerance? What is that data you're trying to protect? What are you currently doing to protect it? Right? Those are the first questions that you need to ask. Then you can start to figure out, well, what are my requirements then from a cloud service provider? Is it okay if I make a lateral move? if I'm, doing very little to protect this data now, is it okay for my cloud service provider to also be doing very little to protect that data? Maybe the data is not that valuable. If it is valuable and you're not doing enough to protect it now, obviously you want to find a vendor that's doing more to protect that data than you are right now, right? So those are the fundamental questions that you need to know and understand before you move on. And then, do I have any regulatory? Am I a covered entity or a business associate, and I have to worry about HIPAA and HIPAA compliance all the way down my supply chain? Am I covered by PCI? And if I am, is this vendor going to be part of my PCI controls? Anywhere in my 12 rules of PCI, is this vendor part of that? And if they are, then they probably need to be certified, right? So what do I have? What's my risk tolerance? What do I need to match up in a vendor? What are my regulatory responsibilities? Those are really the basic questions, and not enough people are asking them before they engage a provider.
And obviously, we have some questions regarding from our audience now regarding this the whole idea of accountability. Obviously, if something were to happen to your data in the cloud, you're accountable. You're the one who will have to address that, correct? It's really going to depend on your agreement with the provider. What does your contract say, right? For instance, if we're talking about HIPAA, there's a lot about HIPAA that's not clear, but one thing is, when you are a covered entity and you do business with a business associate, that business associate has to sign a BAA, a business associate agreement. And in that BAA, they are legally taking responsibility for anything that happens to that data while it's in their custody. And so it is a very clear and legal handoff of that responsibility, right? And so might you, take a reputational hit because you were the people who hired that business associate to handle that data? Sure. But legally, if they're a business associate and they've signed the business associate agreement, then it's their responsibility what they did with that data from a legal perspective. And so a flip side of that question is then, aren't you responsible now for where it is now? And what are you doing to protect that data now? And is it better, more secure with where you've got it now than it would be with your provider? And if your provider is taking their business seriously, then they should be doing more. Because if their business is your data, then they should be taking that business very seriously and making sure they take your data security very seriously. Very good. So what lessons have we learned inside the data center that need to be addressed when using a cloud provider? And what lessons should we have learned from the long history of mainframes and multi-tenant virtual networks that continue to impact some users negatively?
So I think that some lessons from the data center are that doing security only at choke points is a bad idea, and I'll expound on that just a bit. In a traditional data center, you've got a few points where you apply security. You can sort of draw a network map and make a few circles and say security goes here. You've got a perimeter firewall. You might have a second tier of firewalls. And somewhere on your switch, you've got some aggregation ports where you've hung an intrusion detection system or something like that, right? So really what you're doing is you're forcing all your traffic through a couple of choke points and then trying to watch all that traffic there. Well, frequently there's not enough bandwidth. You don't have enough span ports on your switch to cover all the traffic that you need to inspect with an intrusion detection system. You don't have enough processing power to do all the deep packet inspection that you'd like to have. Your applications change much quicker than your depreciation cycle for your hardware. You might have a completely different business model than you did, 9 months ago, 10 months ago, but your hardware has not kept up with that. You might not even have the rack density that you need. And so that sort of capacity planning and that idea of choke point security has not worked well for security professionals in the data center. So what can we do to judo that? What can we do to turn that around and turn that upside down when we move to the cloud? In terms of multi-tenancy and mainframes, this stuff is, good point, has been around forever. None of this is new in that sense. Partitioning is, I think, one of the key things that we should take away from that world. As a service provider, we partition all of our customers at the data layer as well as at the resource layer. We don't want one customer who might be using a lot of resources to negatively impact another. And we obviously don't want any customer data to spill from one silo to another, et cetera. So that siloing and partitioning, which is something that's really well understood in the mainframe world, is something that we are increasingly getting into in the cloud service provider business, and using those same types of models that have been around, for a very long time.
Very good. And I know that we talked a little bit initially about what you're hearing from some of your customers, but I'm wondering if some of the biggest concerns that are voiced to you about cloud security sort of match up with the reality. So how do their concerns match the kinds of security vulnerabilities that are truly impacting cloud-based data today, or are there vulnerabilities that aren't really being addressed at all adequately at this point?
The vulnerabilities that are of primary concern are really applicable just as much, if not more so, in the traditional data center than they are in the cloud. If we look at all of the media-worthy breaches of the last year or two, and there's been, quite a few, none of those were what we would call a cloud-based company. None of those data breaches happened in infrastructure as a service provider, right? There was that case of the celebrities with iCloud. There's a common misconception that Apple's iCloud was breached. It's not the case. Individual user accounts were breached because there was bad password hygiene. The breaches that we've seen in the press have not been cloud breaches. They've been breaches typically of very traditional companies running in very traditional data centers on very traditional applications and operating systems. And so, once again, the concerns that I hear about cloud security are mostly emotional concerns, are mostly, well, I know what I've got now. I can sort of see it and touch it and feel it, and even though I know it's not perfect, even though I know we're not inspecting all of our traffic, even though I know we've got services running on my network that I don't know who ran them and why they're running, even though I know all these things are not great, it's the devil I know. And so really the biggest concern that I hear over and over and over again is, I'm giving up control. Help me feel comfortable with that. But in terms of specific cloud vulnerabilities, there's nothing out there that's any more serious than what we're seeing in our traditional operating systems and relational databases, et cetera.
So one of the things that we've often heard about, and I think I was just talking to another CISO maybe a week ago about this whole notion of visibility into the cloud. Large enterprises generally have greater resources into gaining that visibility. Maybe the smaller ones don't necessarily. What are some of the priorities for the mid-sized firms or companies with smaller IT departments when it comes to visibility into the cloud? What would you suggest there are some of the requirements that they need to make sure they have in place?
Yeah, absolutely. So a big one there is going to be, what are you doing with your cloud logs, and are those available to you, right? Can your cloud provider, your infrastructure provider, share with you the logs of what's going on, who's logging in, what resources or objects they're accessing, any of that activity that's going on, and can you integrate that into your current monitoring technologies? Is that something that you can you view these logs side by side with your Active Directory and see who's logging, with your DHCP, et cetera, right? So a lot of cloud providers do make that data available, but you need to ask, and you need to have a system that can digest it and that can display it alongside your other data that will provide context and relevancy.
And that actually goes to this whole point. I mean, we're hearing a lot about this idea of having more robust threat intelligence, whether it's in a cloud environment or whether it's in your own data center, whatever. It's something that organizations near and far really think is quite a critical component these days, so that it's not only about defense, but it's about reacting very quickly when something does happen. One of our audience members would like to know just how important that area of security is when dealing with cloud services compared to traditional data centers, and could you highlight any differences, I suppose, that perhaps a CISO should take into consideration?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing is you always need a good incident response plan that you've tested. If you are in the middle of an incident and you're asking yourself, what is the plan, what do I do, then you've made a mistake already, right? You need to have a well-thought-out incident response plan, and if you're moving your data to the cloud, you need to adapt that plan for that reality and make sure that it includes things like who is your contact person at your service provider? Do you have any SLAs around security response from your service provider? Which actually goes back to an earlier question you asked. I should have said this. And another thing you should be asking about, the questions you should ask your cloud provider are, do you have a vulnerability management program, and do you have vulnerability management SLA? Are you bound by a certain SLA to fix security issues within a certain period of time? You want to have a thoughtful relationship and partnership with your cloud provider. You want to make sure you know who to talk to, who to call if it's 3 in the morning, and how long it will be before you expect a response. And you need that incident response plan to accommodate for those relationships. Just like it surely, if it's a decent plan, accommodates your realities of your business as it is today. And so, yes, you need to be prepared. Breaches of your own environment, of your cloud environment, breaches happen. And so asking yourself during the breach, what should I be doing, is absolutely the wrong time to ask that question.
Very good. And I suppose to wrap up, to kind of harken back to some of the questions one should ask when they're forming that SLA, you talked a bit about this idea of just making sure folks are fulfilling, or the service providers are fulfilling their obligations. Can you talk a little bit more about what a company can do to ensure that they can really make sure they're getting what was promised, whether it be the idea that if something happens to their network, a business continuity plan kicks in, or they're monitoring vulnerabilities. How can they just make sure that they're getting everything that was promised?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few things. First off, it starts in your negotiations. You need to make sure to get this stuff in writing. Make sure it's in the contract. Make sure you have an SLA. If your cloud service provider is worth their salt, is worth doing business with, they'll have SLAs around these things, and they'll be willing to put that in your contract language. And so negotiating that relationship and that partnership from the very beginning is critical. What are your obligations? Make sure they're spelled out. Make sure that everything that you've put together as you were thinking about what are my crown jewels and what are they worth to me and all of that, make sure that all of that is covered contractually in that arrangement. And if they don't have these SLAs, ask them to make them and ask them to commit to them.
Yeah, definitely. And I would imagine if they don't have the SLAs, it would be a matter of just, in a way, it might even be better because you could just forge something that is, very tailored to your needs, of course.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, that ends today's 2020 webcast. Thanks once again to Sumo Logic's Joan Pepin for really advising us on some sound strategies to get better protected in the cloud. Make sure that cloud providers are really being held accountable for some of the requirements that the client companies themselves need to watch out for, and just working more effectively with all of these service providers. So thank you so much. Really do appreciate the time, Joan.
Thank you so much. This has been a great chat.
And we, of course, really appreciate you all for taking time out of your schedules to be with us for this 2020. You should be able to find an archive of the webcast on our site, scmagazine.com, within 24 hours. So if you'd like to revisit any points Joan made, by all means, take a gander at the site. For those of you whose questions we missed, and it does look like we may have missed one or two, we'll be sure to get back to you with answers by email, so do stay tuned for those. In the meantime, everyone, please be well, and as always, thank you kindly for clicking in.